treated Grandma like a burden until she did something that changed the family forever. My name is Rosa Alvarez, and I want to tell you about the winter I learned to disappear, and the spring I chose to bloom again. It was November in Whitby, Ontario, when the first snow began to fall like whispered secrets against my kitchen window. I stood there, watching the flakes dance in the amber streetlight, my hands wrapped around a cup of chamomile tea that had long since grown cold. The house around me hummed with the familiar sounds of family life, my daughter Carmen's voice drifting from the living room as she helped my grandson Miguel with his homework, the distant sound of my son-in-law David's television program, the gentle creak of floorboards as my granddaughter Sophia moved about upstairs. This was my home. Had been for 3 years now, ever since Carmen invited me to live with them after my husband Eduardo passed. "Mommy, you shouldn't be alone," she had said, her eyes bright with tears and determination. "We have plenty of space, and the kids need their grandmother close." Those words had felt like a lifeline then, a bridge over the chasm of grief that had opened beneath my feet. But now, as I stood in the growing darkness of that November evening, I wondered if I had become more ghost than grandmother in this house that was supposed to be my sanctuary. The realization hadn't come all at once. It crept in slowly, like the frost that forms on window glass, so gradual you don't notice it until suddenly you can't see through clearly anymore. It started with the small things, the way conversations would pause when I entered a room, not in welcome, but in the subtle shift of people who had been discussing something I wasn't meant to hear. The way my suggestions about dinner were acknowledged with polite smiles, but never acted upon. The way my stories about the old days, about Carmen's childhood, about Eduardo's laugh, about the little apartment where we raised our family, were met with gentle but distracted nods. "That's nice, Mammy," became the refrain of my days. I had raised Carmen to be independent, to think for herself, to make her own decisions. I had succeeded perhaps too well. At 67, I found myself living in a house where every choice had already been made, every opinion already formed, every tradition already established, and none of them seemed to have room for me. The November cold seeped through the window as I watched Miguel run through the yard, his breath visible in small puffs as he chased Sophia around the oak tree Eduardo had helped David plant when they first moved to this house. The tree was bare now, its branches reaching toward the grey sky like outstretched arms, seeking something just beyond reach. I remembered when that tree was barely taller than Miguel is now. I remembered the day Eduardo stood in this very spot, his hands on his hips, surveying the yard with the satisfaction of a man who had helped create something that would outlast him. "Rosa," he had said, "one day this tree will shade our great-grandchildren." Now Eduardo was gone, and I was the one watching from the window, separated by glass and time from the life unfolding before me. The kitchen door swung open, and Carmen appeared, her dark hair pulled back in the efficient ponytail she wore for her job at the hospital. She moved with the purposeful energy of someone who had learned to pack too much into too few hours. "Mummy, did you start dinner?" she asked, already moving toward the refrigerator. "I thought we might have that chicken stew recipe your grandmother taught me," I offered, hope threading through my voice like a ribbon through fabric. "Oh, that's sweet, but I already picked up pizza on my way home. The kids have hockey practice tonight, and we need something quick." She pulled out plates from the cabinet, her movements efficient and final. I nodded, swallowing the words that wanted to come. The chicken I had defrosted sat in the refrigerator, another small offering that would go unnoticed, unused. This was how it happened, I realized. not through grand gestures or dramatic moments, but through the accumulation of small erasures. Each "That's nice, Mummy" was a tiny goodbye. Each bypassed suggestion was a door closing. Each simplified explanation was a step toward invisibility. David appeared in the doorway, his tie loosened, his smile warm but tired. "Hey, Rosa. How was your day?" "Good," I said, because that was the expected answer. Because telling him about the afternoon I spent organizing photo albums that no one would look at, or the way I stood in the grocery store for 20 minutes, trying to remember what we needed, because no one had asked me to make a list, would only add weight to shoulders that already carried so much. "That's good," he said, and I could hear in his voice the same distraction I heard in Carmen's, the same gentle distance. He was a good man, David. A good husband to my daughter. A good father to my grandchildren. But I was not his mother, and in the democracy of this household, I had somehow become a minority of one. The pizza arrived as it started to snow harder. We gathered around the dining table, the same table where I had served Eduardo's birthday cake just 2 years ago, where I had helped Miguel with his letters when he was learning to write, where I had taught Sophia to braid challah bread for a school project about different cultures. "So," Carmen said, distributing slices, "I talked to Aunt Maria today. She's planning something big for Christmas this year." My heart lifted. Maria, my sister-in-law, had always been the coordinator of family gatherings. She had a gift for bringing people together, for making every occasion feel special and necessary. "What did she have in mind?" I asked, already imagining the preparations, the cooking, the way the house would fill with laughter and the sound of children playing. "She's thinking of renting that hall at the community center. You know, the one where they had the Rodriguez's anniversary party. She wants to do something really nice, maybe hire a caterer." A caterer? The word felt strange in my mouth. Our family gatherings had always been about grandmother's recipes, about the way each dish carried the story of where we came from. But what about the traditional foods? The tamales, the pozole, the... Oh, Mommy, that's so much work. And Maria thought it would be nice to try something different this year. More modern, you know. Modern. The word settled over me like a blanket that didn't quite cover, leaving parts of me exposed to the cold. "Besides," David added, "this way no one has to spend all day cooking. We can all just enjoy the party." I nodded, because what else was there to do? But inside, I felt something shift, like the moment when you realize you've been walking the wrong direction and have to turn around. The recipes my mother had taught me, that I had taught Carmen, that I had hoped to teach Sophia, they were work, yes. But they were also love made tangible, history handed down through the language of food. That night, I lay in bed listening to the house settle around me. This bedroom had been Eduardo's study before I moved in, filled with his books and papers, his model airplanes and photographs of the places we had traveled together. Carmen had worked hard to make it comfortable for me, painting the walls a soft blue, adding a comfortable chair by the window, clearing space in the closet for my clothes. But it still felt like a guest room, like a place I was borrowing rather than inhabiting. I thought about Christmas, about the hall Maria would rent, about the caterer who would prepare food that carried no memories, no stories, no connection to the generations of women who had stood in kitchens before us, seasoning and tasting and adjusting until each dish was perfect. The snow continued to fall outside, muffling the sounds of the world beyond these walls. In the morning, I knew, David would shovel the driveway, and the children would make snow angels in the yard, and Carmen would rush to get everyone ready for their various activities. And I would watch from the window, or help where I could, always careful not to get in the way. always mindful of the space I was allowed to occupy. December arrived with a bitter cold that seemed to seep into my bones and stay there. The city decorated itself for Christmas, twinkling lights strung between telephone poles, wreaths hanging from storefronts, the Christmas tree in the town square standing like a beacon of hope in the winter darkness. I found myself taking longer walks through the neighborhood, even in the cold. It was on one of these walks that I discovered the little library branch tucked between a coffee shop and a used bookstore. The librarian, a woman about my age with kind eyes and silver hair, always smiled when I came in. "Are you finding everything you need?" she asked one afternoon as I browsed the biography section. "Yes, thank you," I said, though what I was looking for couldn't be found on any shelf. I was looking for purpose, for the feeling that my presence mattered, that my absence would be noticed. "I'm Mrs. Chen, by the way. Lily Chen. I don't think we've been properly introduced." "Rosa Alvarez." Her handshake was firm, her smile genuine. "Are you new to the area, Rosa?" "Not exactly. I live with my daughter and her family. Have for a few years now." Something in my tone must have conveyed more than my words, because Lily's expression softened with understanding. "That's wonderful," she said, but not in the automatic way people usually said it. "And challenging, I imagine." I found myself nodding, surprised by the relief of being understood without having to explain. "I moved in with my son and his family after my husband passed," Lily continued. "It's an adjustment, isn't it? Being part of a family that's already found its rhythm." "Yes," I said, the word carrying more weight than it should have been able to hold. "Yes, it is." We stood there for a moment, two women who had learned that love doesn't always translate into belonging, that being wanted and being needed are not the same thing. "Well," Lily said, "if you ever want to chat, I'm here most afternoons. And we have a book club that meets on Wednesdays. You might enjoy it." I thanked her and left with a biography of Georgia O'Keeffe, but what I really carried with me was the gift of being seen, of having someone look at me and recognize not just a grandmother, not just someone's mother, but Rosa, a woman with her own thoughts and feelings and worth. That evening, I sat in my blue room reading about Georgia O'Keeffe's struggle to be taken seriously as an artist, to be seen as more than just the woman who painted flowers. There was something in her story that resonated with me. This sense of being reduced to other people's perceptions, of having your complexity simplified into something more comfortable for others to understand. I had been an accountant before I married Eduardo, had run my own small bookkeeping business for years. I had raised 2 children, learned to speak 3 languages, traveled to 12 countries. I had opinions about politics and books and art. I had dreams that extended beyond being anyone's mother or grandmother. But somewhere along the way, I had allowed myself to become only those things. And now, even in those roles, I felt myself shrinking. Christmas was 3 weeks away when it happened, the moment that changed everything, though I didn't know it then. I was coming back from the library, my arms full of books and a few small gifts I had bought for the children, when I heard voices from the living room. The front door was heavy, and I struggled with it for a moment, finally pushing it open with my hip. "Just think it would be easier if we didn't have to worry about..." The voices stopped abruptly as I entered, and I looked up to see Carmen and David sitting on the couch, their faces wearing the careful expressions of people who had been caught in the middle of something. "Hi, Mummy," Carmen said, her voice bright with the kind of cheer that comes from wanting to change the subject quickly. "How was the library?" "Good," I said, setting down my bags. "What were you talking about?" "Oh, just Christmas stuff. Boring logistics." But I had heard enough to know it wasn't boring logistics. I had heard the tone, the way Carmen's voice had dropped when she said worry about. I had heard David's murmur of agreement. They were talking about me, about how I complicated things, how I made simple decisions more difficult, how I was something to be managed rather than included. I excused myself and went to my room, closing the door quietly behind me. For a long time, I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the wall where Carmen had hung a cheerful landscape print. Pretty, safe, temporary. Nothing that would leave a mark if it needed to be removed. That night, I couldn't sleep. I found myself standing at my window, looking out at the snow-covered yard, at the bare oak tree that Eduardo had helped plant. In the moonlight, its branches looked like veins, like the network of connections that keeps something alive. I thought about the Christmas gatherings of my childhood, about the way my own grandmother had been the center of everything, not because she demanded it, but because she was essential. Her hands that knew every recipe by heart, her voice that could settle any argument, her presence that made everything feel more real, more important. When had I stopped being essential? When had I become optional? The answer came to me slowly, like morning light creeping across the floor. I had stopped being essential when I stopped insisting on my own value, when I started saying that's nice to my own dreams, when I started asking permission for things that should have been my right. The next morning, I made a decision. I would not spend Christmas being managed, being accommodated, being treated like a delicate thing that needed to be handled carefully. I would not sit in that rented hall eating catered food while the recipes my mother taught me gathered dust in my memory. But I would not fight either. I would not demand or argue or make anyone feel guilty for the way things had evolved. Instead, I would do something that Eduardo had taught me long ago. I would show them who I was, rather than tell them. I started with the photo albums. For days, I went through every album, every box, every envelope of pictures that had followed me from house to house over the years. I spread them out on my bed, on the floor, organizing them chronologically, remembering the stories behind each one. Here was Carmen at 3, her face covered in chocolate cake from her birthday party, her eyes bright with mischief. Here was Eduardo teaching her to ride a bike in the park, his hand steady on her back. Here was our wedding day, both of us young and nervous, and so sure we knew what love meant. Here was Christmas morning, 1987, Carmen and her brother Roberto opening presents while I stood in the background, my hair in curlers, my apron dusted with flour from the bread I had been making. I was young then, probably younger than Carmen is now, but I looked so confident, so sure of my place in the world. When had I lost that certainty? I found pictures of Eduardo's mother, my mother-in-law Elena, who had lived with us for the last 5 years of her life. I remembered how challenging it had been, how we had struggled to find the right balance between caring for her and maintaining our own family's rhythms. I remembered the way she had sometimes seemed lost in our modern world, with its microwaves and cable television and cell phones. But I also remembered the stories she told, the way she could make even the most ordinary day feel connected to something larger, something that mattered. I remembered the way Miguel and Sofia had loved sitting with her, listening to her tales of growing up in Mexico, of the family we had left behind. Elena had never let herself disappear, even when her body began to fail her. She had insisted on her stories, on her memories, on the value of her experience. She had never said, "That's nice," to her own worth. On December 15th, I made my decision. I found Carmen in the kitchen, packing lunches for the children. She moved with her usual efficiency, but I could see the tiredness around her eyes, the way her shoulders carried the weight of too many responsibilities. "My daughter," I said, using the endearment I had called her since she was small. "I need to tell you something." She looked up, her hands stilling on Miguel's sandwich. "What is it, Mammy?" "I won't be going to Christmas dinner at the hall." The words sat between us like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples outward. "What do you mean? Of course you'll be there. It's Christmas." "I know, and I'll be celebrating, just not there." Carmen set down the sandwich, her full attention on me now. "I don't understand. Are you feeling okay? Are you sick?" "No, my daughter. I'm not sick. I'm just choosing something different." "But why? Did something happen? Did Maria say something?" I could see the worry in her eyes, the way she was already trying to fix whatever problem she thought I had presented her with. This was Carmen's way to solve, to manage, to make everything work. It was one of the things I loved most about her, and one of the things that had made me feel most invisible. "Nothing happened," I said gently. "I just realized that I want to spend Christmas being myself, not being taken care of." "What does that mean?" I had rehearsed this conversation in my head, but now that I was having it, the words felt different than I had expected. More important somehow, more final. "It means I want to cook the foods I grew up with. I want to tell the stories I remember. I want to be the grandmother I am, not the one that's easiest for everyone else." Carmen stared at me, her expression shifting from confusion to something that might have been hurt. "Are you saying we don't let you be yourself?" "I'm saying I stopped insisting on it." We stood there in the kitchen, the morning light streaming through the window, highlighting the distance that had grown between us without either of us noticing. Carmen looked so much like I had at her age, determined, competent, sure that love meant solving problems and making everything smooth. "So what are you going to do?" she asked finally. "Spend Christmas alone?" "I don't know yet, but I know I won't spend it being invisible." Carmen's face crumpled slightly, and I saw in her expression the little girl who used to climb into my lap when she was sad, who trusted me to make everything better. "I never meant for you to feel invisible, Mammy." "I know, my daughter. I know." I reached for her hand, and she let me take it. Her skin was warm, familiar, carrying the same small scar on her knuckle that she had gotten when she was 7 and tried to help me in the kitchen. "I love you," I said. "I love this family, but I need to love myself too." That evening, I called Maria. "Rosa, I was just thinking about you. I've been working on the menu for Christmas, and I think we should go with something really elegant. Maybe that new fusion restaurant that just opened in Mississauga." "That sounds lovely, Maria, but I wanted to let you know that I won't be able to make it." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Maria had always been the organizer, the one who made sure everyone was included, everyone was accounted for. My absence would be a disruption to her careful plans. "What do you mean you won't be able to make it? Are you sick?" "No, I'm fine. I'm choosing to do something different this year." "Different how?" I found myself smiling, though she couldn't see it. "I'm going to have the kind of Christmas I want to have." "And what kind is that?" "The kind where I cook pozole from scratch and tell stories about your brother that make everyone cry and laugh at the same time. The kind where I matter not because I'm being taken care of, but because I have something to offer." Maria was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice was softer. "You know, Rosa, I've been thinking about hiring a caterer because I thought it would be easier for everyone. But maybe easy isn't the same as meaningful." "Maybe not," I agreed. "What if we did something different? What if we had Christmas at my house and you and I cooked together, like we used to when Eduardo and Alfonso were alive? The offer hung in the air between us, unexpected and precious. I thought about Maria's kitchen, about the way we had worked together so many times before, our hands knowing the same rhythms, our voices filling the space with memory and laughter. "I would love that," I said, "but only if you want me there because of who I am, not because you feel sorry for me." "Rosa Alvarez," Maria said, and I could hear the smile in her voice. "I want you there because you make the best tamales in Ontario, and because you're the only one who remembers the stories about Eduardo's first job, and because Christmas isn't Christmas without you arguing with me about how much cumin to put in the pozole." I laughed, and it felt like the first real laugh I had had in months. "Then yes," I said, "I'll be there." The next few days passed in a strange kind of suspension. Carmen and David were careful around me, polite in the way people are when they're not sure what they might say wrong. The children, sensitive to the new tension in the house, were quieter than usual. I continued my daily walks, continued my visits to the library, continued the quiet work of remembering who I was. Lily Chen and I had begun having regular conversations, and she had introduced me to the Wednesday book club. For the first time in months, I found myself looking forward to something that was entirely my own. It was on one of these walks, 3 days before Christmas, that I made another discovery. I was walking past the community centre where Maria had originally planned to hold our dinner, when I saw a sign in the window: "Volunteers needed Christmas dinner for seniors." Below it, in smaller print, "Help us provide a warm meal and companionship for community members who might otherwise spend the holiday alone." I stopped walking and stared at the sign. Around me, snow began to fall again, gentle and purposeful. I thought about all the Christmases I had spent making sure everyone else had what they needed, all the energy I had poured into creating the perfect holiday for my family. What if there were other people like me? People who had been made to feel invisible, who had learned to shrink themselves to fit into other people's plans. I pushed through the door of the community centre. The woman at the desk looked up with a smile. She was about my age, with grey hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. "Can I help you?" I saw the sign about volunteers for Christmas dinner. "Oh, wonderful. We can always use help. Are you interested in cooking, serving, or just spending time with people?" "All of it," I said, surprising myself with the certainty in my voice. "I want to do all of it." Her smile widened. "I'm Barbara Peterson. I coordinate the volunteer program." "Rosa Alvarez. And I have some ideas about the menu." That evening, I sat at my desk writing 2 letters. The first was to my family. "My dear ones, I want you to know that I love you more than words can express. Nothing I am about to do comes from a place of anger or hurt, but from a place of love. Love for you, and love for myself. I have spent the last few months feeling invisible, and I realized that I was the one who had made myself disappear. I stopped insisting on my own worth, stopped believing that my presence was a gift rather than a burden. This Christmas, I am choosing to spend the holiday doing something that makes me feel essential again. I will be volunteering at the community centre, cooking for people who might otherwise spend the holiday alone. I will be telling stories and sharing the recipes that my mother taught me, that her mother taught her. I hope you can understand that this is not about leaving you, but about finding myself. I hope that when I return, I will be the grandmother you deserve, not the one who asks permission to exist, but the one who knows her own value. I love you all. Have a beautiful Christmas. Grandmother Rosa. The second letter was to myself. Rosa, you are 67 years old, and you are not finished yet. You have stories to tell, food to cook, love to give. You have earned the right to take up space in this world. Stop apologizing for your presence. Stop asking permission to matter. Stop saying that's nice to your own dreams. You are essential. Act like it. With love and determination, yourself. On Christmas Eve, I woke before dawn and began cooking. Not the quick, efficient meals that fit into my family's schedule, but the slow, deliberate food of celebration. I made pozole, each kernel of hominy added with intention. I made tamales, my hands remembering the rhythm my mother had taught me 50 years ago. I made flan, Eduardo's favorite dessert, because he had always said that Christmas wasn't complete without something sweet to end the meal. The kitchen filled with scents of my childhood, of holidays when being the cook meant being the center of everything, when my skills were not just appreciated, but necessary. Carmen found me there at 7 in the morning, standing at the stove stirring the pozole while tears ran down my cheeks. "Mummy?" I turned to face her, this daughter I had raised to be strong and independent, who had learned perhaps too well to take care of everything herself. "I'm making Christmas dinner," I said simply. "But you said you weren't coming to Maria's." "I'm not. This is for the community center, for people who don't have family to spend Christmas with." Carmen stared at me, and I saw in her face the moment when she understood what I was really saying, that I had become one of those people, even while living in a house full of family. "Oh, Mommy," she said, and her voice broke a little. "I'm so sorry." "Don't be sorry, my daughter. Be different." She nodded, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "Can I help?" I looked at her standing there in her pajamas, her hair messy from sleep, her face open with the kind of vulnerability that comes from recognizing a mistake that can't be undone but might be forgiven. "Do you remember how to make sopapillas?" A smile broke across her face. "I remember you trying to teach me about 50 times. Then we better try again." We worked together in the kitchen as the sun rose, our hands bumping as we reached for the same ingredients, our voices filling the space with the kind of conversation that comes from shared work. Carmen asked about the spices, about the timing, about the stories behind each dish. "Why did Grandmother Elena always add chocolate to the pozole?" she asked. "Because she said it made people remember that even in the middle of winter there were still sweet things in the world." "And why do you always make exactly 48 tamales?" "Because that's how many it took to feed your father's whole family when we were first married, and I never wanted anyone to go hungry." As we cooked, David appeared in the doorway, followed by Miguel and Sofia. They stood there watching us work, and I realized that they had rarely seen us like this, not as grandmother and daughter, but as two women who knew how to create something beautiful together. "It smells amazing in here," David said. "Grandmother is making Christmas dinner for people who don't have families," Sophia announced, and I heard in her voice a note of pride that I hadn't heard in a long time. "Can we help?" Miguel asked. I looked around at my family, at the kitchen filled with the chaos of real cooking, at the faces that were looking at me with something I hadn't seen in months recognition. Not of their burden or their obligation, but of their essential grandmother, the one who had stories to tell and skills to share. "There's a lot to do," I said. "We'll need to pack everything carefully and load the car and get to the community center by noon." "We?" Carmen asked. "Well, you can't expect me to serve 40 people by myself," I said. "Besides, I think it's time you all met Barbara Peterson. She's been looking for volunteers." That afternoon, we loaded the car with more food than I had cooked in months. The pozole in its large pot, the tamales wrapped in corn husks, the flan in its glass dishes. We drove through the snowy streets of Whitby, past the Christmas decorations and the warm windows of other people's homes, toward the community center where Barbara Peterson was waiting. The hall was decorated with paper snowflakes and string lights. Nothing fancy, but everything touched with the kind of care that comes from wanting to make something special with limited resources. There were round tables set with red tablecloths and volunteer servers wearing green aprons, and about 30 people ranging in age from elderly to middle-aged, all of them carrying the particular loneliness that comes from having no place to go on Christmas Day. Barbara met us at the door, her face lighting up when she saw our loaded arms. "Rosa, you've outdone yourself." "I brought help," I said, gesturing to my family. Carmen stepped forward with a confidence I recognized from her hospital work. "I'm Carmen. My mother has been telling me about what you do here." "We're honored to have you," Barbara said. "All of you." What followed was the most meaningful Christmas I had experienced in years. Not because it was perfect, but because it was necessary. Because every dish I served was received with gratitude. Every story I told was listened to with attention. Every moment of my presence was valued. I watched Carmen ladle pozole into bowls, asking each person about their preference for toppings. I watched David help Sophia carry plates to tables, both of them learning the names of the people they served. I watched Miguel sit with an elderly man named Frank, listening to stories about World War II with the kind of fascination that comes from discovering that history is made of individual people, not just dates and events. And I watched myself, as if from a distance, moving through the room with the confidence of someone who knows her own worth. I was not invisible here. I was essential. "Rosa," said a woman named Margaret, who had been coming to these dinners for 3 years. "This is the best tamale I've ever tasted. Could you teach me how to make them?" "Of course," I said, and meant it. "But they're better when you make them with other people. It's not really about the recipe." "What's it about then?" I thought about the question, about the morning I had spent in the kitchen with Carmen, about the way cooking together had rebuilt something between us that words alone couldn't have fixed. "It's about remembering that we all have something to offer," I said, "and that sharing what we know is how we stay connected to each other." As the afternoon wore on, I found myself telling stories about Eduardo, about my children when they were young, about the Mexico I remembered from my childhood visits. People gathered around me, their faces interested, their questions genuine. "Your grandmother sounds like she was an amazing woman," said a man named Robert after I finished telling them about Eleanor's journey from Mexico to Canada. "She was," I said. "But the most amazing thing about her was that she never forgot who she was, even when everything around her changed." "That's a hard thing to hold on to," said Margaret. "Yes," I agreed, "but it's the only thing that's really ours." As we cleaned up that evening, Carmen worked beside me in the community center kitchen, washing dishes and packing up the leftover food. "Mommy," she said quietly, "I want to apologize." "For what? For making you feel invisible? For treating you like you were something to be managed instead of someone to be celebrated?" I dried my hands on a dish towel and turned to face her. "Carmen, you didn't make me invisible. I made myself invisible. I stopped insisting on my own importance. But we should have seen..." "Yes, you should have. But I should have helped you see." She nodded, her eyes bright with tears. "Can you forgive us?" "My daughter, there's nothing to forgive. There's only something to change." "How?" I thought about the question, about the long journey that had brought us to this moment, from the November evening when I first felt myself disappearing to this Christmas Day, when I had remembered how to be essential. "By remembering that love isn't just about taking care of each other," I said. It's about making space for each other to be who we really are. That night, as we drove home through the snow-covered streets, the car filled with the comfortable tiredness that comes from work well done, Miguel asked a question that made me smile. "Grandmother, will you teach me how to make tamales?" "Of course, mijo. But we'll need to start with the stories. The recipes don't work without the stories." "What stories?" I looked out at the winter landscape, at the Christmas lights twinkling in windows, at the oak tree in our yard that was visible now as we turned into our driveway. "The stories about where we come from," I said. "About the people who came before us. About the love that got passed down through recipes and traditions, and the simple act of making something beautiful with your hands." "Will you tell me about my great-grandmother, Elena?" "I will tell you everything I remember." And I meant it. Not just about Eleanor, but about all of it, the stories, the recipes, the traditions that connected us to something larger than ourselves. I would tell them not as someone asking permission to speak, but as someone who knew that her voice mattered, that her memories were treasures, that her presence was a gift. The next morning, I woke to the sound of Carmen in the kitchen, making breakfast for her family. But this time, instead of staying in my room until it was convenient to appear, I got up and joined her. "Good morning, my daughter." "Good morning, Mummy. I was thinking, would you like to help me make breakfast? I was going to make pancakes, but maybe we could make those Mexican sweet rolls you used to make when I was little." "Conscious," I said, smiling. "Yes, I'd love to, but they take time. We'll need to start the dough now if we want them for breakfast." "I have time," Carmen said, and I heard in her voice something new, not the efficient accommodation of someone managing a problem, but the genuine interest of someone who wanted to learn. "Then let's begin." As we worked together, mixing the dough, I felt something shift in the very air around us. Carmen's hands moved uncertainly at first, then with growing confidence as muscle memory returned. The kitchen filled with the scent of vanilla and cinnamon, but more than that, it filled with the sound of my daughter asking questions she had forgotten to ask. "Mummy, why do you always make the cross pattern on top?" "Because your great-grandmother said it was like leaving a blessing in the bread, something to keep the family connected, even when we're apart." Sophia appeared in the doorway, still in her pajamas, drawn by the unfamiliar sounds of unhurried morning cooking. "What are you making?" "Conscious," Carmen said, and I heard pride in her voice. "Grandmother is teaching me." "Teaching us," Sophia corrected, moving to wash her hands. "I want to learn too." 3 generations of women, standing in the morning light, our hands covered in flour, our voices weaving together stories and instructions and laughter. This was what I had been missing, not just being included, but being necessary. Not just being loved, but being essential. As the sweet rolls baked, filling the house with warmth and promise, David and Miguel joined us at the kitchen table. The conversation flowed differently now, less polite, more real. I told them about the people we had met yesterday, about Margaret, who wanted to learn to make tamales, about Frank, who had reminded me of Eduardo with his gentle humor. "Can we go back next week?" Miguel asked. I promised Frank I'd bring him a book about airplanes. "Of course we can," I said, and realized that we had become something new, not just accommodation, but partnership. That evening, as I sat in my blue room organizing the photos I had been avoiding for months, Carmen knocked on my door. "Mummy, can I come in?" She sat on the edge of my bed, looking at the photographs spread around us, decades of family life, of celebrations and ordinary moments, of the woman I had been before I learned to disappear. "I want to understand," she said quietly. "When did I stop seeing you?" I picked up a photo from Christmas, 1995, Carmen and Roberto as teenagers. Eduardo and me still young enough to believe we had endless time. Elena in her chair by the tree, holding baby Miguel. In the photo, Elena was clearly the center of everything, her presence anchoring the entire frame. "You didn't stop seeing me," I said. "I stopped insisting on being seen." "But why?" I thought about the question, about the long process of small erasures that had brought me to that November evening when I first felt myself disappearing. "Because I was afraid," I said finally. "Afraid that if I insisted on too much space, you might decide there wasn't room for me at all." Carmen's eyes filled with tears. "Oh, Mummy, never. There will always be room for you." "Yes," I said, understanding finally settling over me like a warm blanket. "But the room has to be the right size, big enough for all of who I am, not just the parts that are easy to manage." She nodded, picking up a photo of me at her wedding, my face radiant with joy and pride. "I want to know all of who you are, the stories, the recipes, the dreams you had before you became our mother and grandmother." "Some of those dreams are still alive," I said, surprising myself with the truth of it. "Tell me." I looked around the room at the careful blue walls, at the comfortable chair by the window, at the space that had been prepared for me with love, but without understanding. Tomorrow, I would ask Carmen to help me redecorate, not to make it more comfortable, but to make it more mine. "I want to teach cooking classes," I said. "Not just recipes, but the stories behind them. I want to help other people remember that food is love made visible." "That's beautiful, Mummy. And I want to write down Elena's stories, all of them, so that Miguel and Sofia will know where they come from." "I'll help you," Carmen said. "We'll do it together." Spring came early that year, arriving in March with sudden warmth and the promise of new growth. I stood at my kitchen window, no longer the guest room window, but the kitchen window of a house where I belonged, watching Miguel and Sofia play in the yard. The oak tree that Eduardo had helped plant was beginning to bud, its bare branches showing the first hint of green. Barbara Peterson had offered me a permanent position coordinating the community center's meal program. Carmen had helped me set up cooking classes in our church basement. Sofia had started a school project about family recipes that was turning into a neighborhood cookbook. I was no longer invisible. More importantly, I was no longer trying to be invisible. The garden that Eduardo and I had planted together was coming back to life, and I realized that I was like those perennial bulbs not dead during the winter, just waiting for the right conditions to bloom again. My name is Rosa Alvarez, and I want to tell you about the winter I learned to disappear, and the spring I chose to bloom again. The invisible garden was never really invisible. It was just waiting for someone to remember that it was there, to tend it with intention, to believe in its capacity for growth. Some gardens need to rest before they can flourish. But when they do bloom, they bloom with the deep roots of everything they've survived, everything they've learned, everything they've chosen to become. I am blooming now, at 67, with all the colors I had forgotten I contained. And the garden is beautiful.